Welcome to this final plenary session that will bring these 3 days of conference together to a close. I hope you all had a chance to review the positions in the gallery, in the Rhine Gallery. I think they will be still here after the plenary if you want to have a quick look. There are also some additional statements coming out. So there were also some additional statements feverishly put together. One is the red flag statement coming from the plenary, and Michael is going to give us quickly his 8 points. Michael, please. Michael is going to give us his 8 points very soon.
I'm here. But I need some help from my team as well, because I don't have them all completely written. Can I take? Okay, so in the red flag group, we had a discussion about what are the main areas that we want to highlight to the high-level panel. We've written a brief introduction highlighting that there's these tensions between the role of government and private sector and multilateral institutions when it comes to development. And we're saying there are 8 key issues that we're raising a red flag on, red card on, and that these must be addressed to have our support in the post-2015 development agenda. Savio, do you have the 8 there, the piece of paper? I can try and do from memory, but I don't want to. Okay, so we have extractive industries, we have land and water grabs, we have human rights, we have gender, we have accountability and corruption, we have, I believe, planetary boundaries, that's 6. Who else is in the group can please add on? I don't have them all right here. So. Right, we have economic and financial architecture, and we have peace and human security. We are still finalizing the document. We will work on it again at 3:30, so anybody who wants to assist or to read or to give comments at that point in time, please join us. We will still be here. So basically, as soon as the plenary is over, we will continue to do that. Once it is completed, it will go online. So it will be on the Berlin Society website and World We Want 2015, where you as individuals or as organizations can sign on and can share it. We will also ensure that it goes to the high-level panel. So we will send it to Homi and to the Chief Liaison Officer in that office.
Thank you very much. So some people have not stopped working yet and will continue to do so after 3:30. Another statement that reached us is a message from the Latin American and Caribbean region. I was wondering if somebody here would be happy to speak to it for a minute, maybe some of the authors. I've got the English version here. Yeah?
Okay, yes, I can read it. I was not expecting this, so sorry. So, the message from the Latin American and the Caribbean region present at the Civil Society Conference in regard to the post-2015 agenda, advancing the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda in Bonn, Germany. We are concerned about the ambivalent character of the global processes led by United Nations, post-2015 and post-Rio Plus 20, as well as the huge barriers for achieving a real, plural, broad, and inclusive participation of the proposals and visions of civil society. We believe that a new paradigm for sustainable development demands a transformation of accumulation and redistribution patterns of wealth, as well as a strong action to confront poverty in its different dimensions. We must measure and control wealth as a global goal to truly eradicate inequalities and poverty in all its levels, and thus achieve an equalitarian and sustainable development. We believe it is worrying that the lead author and executive secretary of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on post-2015 development agenda.
Can you slow down a little bit because the translators are struggling?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. We believe it is worrying that the lead author and executive secretary of the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on the post-2015 development agenda states that in the face of the so-called insufficient financial resources of governments, resorting to private capital as a financial source is needed, when we know that it is one of the main responsible actors for the current global crisis, thus minimizing the responsibilities and the potential of nation-states. We call for people's action in getting organized and mobilized in their own countries in order to demand that financial and development decision-making institutions eradicate the multiple inequalities derived from discrimination by gender, age, class, race, sexual diversity, disability, and others. At the same time, we demand those institutions to confront the different crises that are threatening humanity, such as environmental, social, food, economic, financial, energetic, climate change, feminization of poverty, violence in all its forms and expressions, especially against women, migrants, and indigenous populations, as well as in global governance. Civil society organizations, as actors of development, demand changes that guarantee respect and due exercise of all human rights of women and men around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really impressive to see how many statements also came directly here from the conference, in addition to the ones from the sessions. Just to remind everybody, they will be also available, all the statements and positions and outcome documents coming from the sessions and here from the conference will be available on worldwewant2015.org, and with a short time delay also translated into French and Spanish. Now, without any further delay, I would like to hand over to a fellow steering committee member, Roberto Bisio, the coordinator from Social Watch. He was part of the harvesting team and will now share with us his impression as a summary of the conference.
Do I get a mic?
And you already have one.
Oh. Sorry. Thank goodness I was not speaking any secret conspiracy over there. We did them all before, don't worry. So, I'm supposed to report of the secret conspiracy of the harvesting team. But as we said several times, the harvest has been enormously productive, and everything that we harvested during this conference is being made available on the website. So that includes all the statements with the signatures and those that are still being finished. So we have an ongoing conference process, at least for a few hours after the meeting ends. It includes also the scribblings, which is a way of expressing and harvesting and summarizing what we were all saying. There is a collection of tweets that were happening during the conference, and there are webcasts of the whole speeches and panel discussions and so on that can be revised. So I guess that it cannot be more transparent than that, and that's in a way according to the spirit of transparency in this very building that we are in. The harvesting team tried to help all this input and so on to appear, and we did our also preliminary readings of it, which appears in this one-page preamble that is also hanging out there together with the different statements and conclusions and sign-ons that basically explains that we are gathered here in this conference, that we are hundreds of people from all around the world, from a variety of organizations. We thank the organizers, the Berlin Center for Civil Society, for organizing. We thank the German Ministry for Cooperation for supporting this. Yes, they deserve a hand. And we also thank DESA, UN DESA, that really not only were very kind in stimulating this process, but also sat through all of our sessions, discussions, and so on, and took notes. So we do know that they are hearing what we are saying. So that is also real special thanks. We had 10 thematic areas, and you know which they are, but it's good reading them. Securing human rights for all, respecting planetary boundaries, structural transformation for women's rights and gender justice, new economic paradigm, securing social justice, new global partnership on sustainable development, climate change, securing a decent future for all, children, youth, and adolescents, peace and security, and ending poverty, which is each one of them is a whole agenda, and all of them are interlinked and cannot really be solved, any of them in isolation and not together. So we are very happy to see that some people are discussing ending poverty, but our message to them is you cannot solve that if you don't have a more comprehensive and holistic view. Now, during these 3 days and across all those discussions, I cannot possibly talk about the content and the richness in each of those subjects, but there are some very clear points, I would say 4 points, for those that want brevity, that come out across all of them. And the first one is very clearly human rights. Human rights is the basis for any development agenda, is the basis for the United Nations. It was created around that. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights dates from 1948. It is legal instrument internationally, and it has been incorporated into the constitutions and the legal systems of a majority of the countries around the world. So to claim that the work we are doing in development is rooted in that is no exaggerated claim. It's just to state something which should be obvious. And of course, human rights is not just the rights themselves, but the whole architecture that monitors them, that provides channels for citizens to bring out their complaints. And the good news around that is that in May, for example, the optional protocol to the International Convention on Human Rights is going to take into effect. And that means that citizens and NGOs can now directly complain to a UN treaty body about violations of their economic, social, and cultural rights. So that's really important, because finally those rights have the same status as the Convention Against Torture or the rights of women or all the other human rights that have a complaint mechanism, and that now is also valid for social, economic, and cultural rights. So that's something to celebrate and to take into account. What human rights include is spelled out there, and the list is very big, and precisely, even because architecture is comprehensive. And probably most of the goals we would like to see happening in the world are already included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Planetary boundaries is something that was not there as a concept when the United Nations were created. The thought of optimism and so on was that progress could go on forever and ever and ever, and everybody would ultimately achieve unending limits of prosperity. We now know this is not the case, and we know that very dramatically. Now, the important discussion is how do we respect those limits and avoid further catastrophes in the world, but also how do we share the burden of adjusting to those limits. And there again, the human rights framework provides a lot of guidance as to what is the essential dignity of every human being and the fairness in which that burden has to be distributed. And the United Nations have the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in that burden sharing. Responsibilities is common, but our capacities differ, and that the burden has to be adjusted to that. That is also universal principles. The world does not reflect those principles in reality. We go out of here and we say, hey, those principles are very nice, but peace is not existing everywhere. Violence is existing at all levels, from the personal body to the whole communities and state and nuclear arms at the end, and we were reminded by former German President Horst Köhler and former managing director of the IMF that, and I quote, "We cannot talk about food security without regulation of financial markets, poverty without addressing unfair trade, peace and security without arms control, land degradation without talking of climate." What it means, and that was a powerful inaugural message that was taken in many of our discussion, is that there are rules that need to be created, and there are the wrong rules that need to be modified. Because if we don't regulate finance, quoting Köhler that knows about the issue, former IMF managing director, we cannot solve food. And we need to undo many of the wrong rules that constrain the realization of human rights and of development goals. And finally, the goals must be universal, inequalities need to be addressed, the responsibilities of the rich and powerful need to be clearly spelled out and subject to scrutiny. Commitments have to be accountable. And transparency, as we started and as this very building reflects, is paramount to all of that. Now, these are cross-cutting themes that we put them on a preamble because we understand, okay, now we spell that out, and in spelling that out, we will find a lot of debate, a lot of discrepancies, a lot of nuances here and there, but there is a common understanding of what the minimum platform is, and that is what we tried to spell out. Just one final reflection. I was reading in Facebook research that has become viral. There is a Dutch scientist that studies chimpanzees. And he says that he studies chimpanzees because they don't talk, they act. So he wouldn't be interested in what we have been doing here, which was mainly talk. But he wanted to find out whether chimpanzees have a sense of fairness. And so he put them to do some task together. They have to pull a lever at the same time or things like that. Then the prize, that is rewarded. And he found out that chimpanzees share the reward equally among those that participated in the task. And they do that quite systematically. 2 people participated, they get 4 bananas, it's 2 for each. And they can even do some elementary math and divide among 3 and so on. So it's well established that that sense of fairness exists, as well as it exists on babies even before they talk, that they have a sense of fairness. But then he went on with the experiment, and the prize was started to be given to one of the team members without the others knowing what the prize was. So there were 3 of them, and one of them gets 6 bananas, and then he takes 1 banana and gives it to each of the other 2 members and keeps the rest. And that is also systematically happening, as long as the prize is not known. So the sense of fairness exists, but without transparency, it doesn't get applied to practice. I guess that is probably something that we can learn. And I would say, at the end of it all, and if we learn from the chimpanzees, what happened this morning synthesizes, not in 4 paragraphs, but in 1 word, what we want, and that was the women groups claiming justice. So I think that justice is the word that if we have to summarize in 1 word, we can bring home, And that means economic justice, that means climate justice, that means gender justice. I also heard erotic justice, am I right? Okay, I want to find out more what that means. But if the UN already incorporated a day of happiness, why not in a near future we'll have a day of erotic justice? Can you bring that to the General Assembly? So, please, with that, we are going to discuss global partnerships in a panel. And so I'm inviting our panelists. I'm going to introduce them as they come here to the front. So, of course, first one I'm losing here is Shamshad Akhtar, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, who is the head of DESA, UN advisor to the UN Secretary General on this whole process towards 2015, and has a long history as an economist in her own country in Pakistan and at the World Bank. So welcome. Everybody knows you. You've been already here several times. Then we have, talking about the World Bank, Christopher Thomas, who is here. He's advisor to the World Bank President's Special Envoy on the MDGs. And I'm not making the story longer than that. Please, Christopher Thomas. And then we have here with us, where are the others, Mariama Williams, who is an economist and from the South Center. Come here, please, Mariama. We have a majority of economists here. Huh? But she has also a long history in the NGO movement, was one of the founders of Dawn Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, and she was also a researcher on Gender and Trade Network, among many other positions, and is currently also affiliated to the South Center. We have here with us Ruth Fuller, who is the lead in the WWF UK lead on international development and co-chair of the Beyond 2015 campaign in the UK. So, and of course, her background is on environment and poverty reduction and the links between environment and development agendas. And finally, well, come here. I don't have a biography for you, but Wael is heading the Climate Action Network International. So we will give our two guests 5 minutes each to talk about the new kind of global partnerships that we need to shape. Then the rest will comment. I'm not sitting there, I will stand here so I can push you a bit, and I will try to promote debate, discussion, shouting, whatever, and then we will open to the floor. I guess we have around 1 hour for that before the final speech. So, Shamshad, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and once again, it's a real delight to be here. These have been 3 intense days, and I have benefited a lot from hearing the wide spectrum of views out here. Since I'm representing United Nations here, I would be amiss if I did not remind this forum of what the 2006 resolution on global partnerships talked about, so that we put in context what does it mean for global partnership. And this, remember, has been deliberated and agreed upon script. It says that General Assembly defined partnership as voluntary relationships between both public and non-public segments in which all participants agreed to work together to achieve common purpose on specific task. Global partnerships, as we know, have really grown in form, body, substance over the last decade or so. And they are really, can be grouped into, I guess, in a very broad sense, in 2 categories. One is multi-stakeholder consultative processes, which deals with topic to reach more consensus on and defining the rules of the games, and also attempt to push the advocacy frontier. And second type of global partnership are types where we are trying to pool the expertise, resources, skills to push for a specific goal or target. I'm trying to simplify what is a very broad landscape so that we know where we are getting. I think there has been mixed results. There has been very good result on certain fronts, and in other areas we've had kind of a little more lackluster progress. Underlying all this has been, this mixed performance has been where you have good consensus. Of course, underlying that is really the political will. I think what stands out clearly is the trade agenda, where we have not been able to reach a desirable trade consensus on the rules of game going forward. However, we do see that trade has grown substantially because of the inertia of the countries. A second broad point I wanted to mention is that while we are struggling with various forms and bodies of these, the type of resources funding global partnerships, the mix has changed quite a bit. Earlier, ODA was a principal flow of support. ODA has grown indeed, but in net terms, as we know, it's about 0.31% of the GDP in an aggregate sense, and recent results coming out is that there has been a decline. And of course, underlying this is different performance of different ODA participants. They have played a role in nurturing global partnerships in different forms also. But what has become important more is the private flows of different types. One is, of course, the formal investment flows. The second is philanthropic contributions. Third is remittances. And these three broad categories have different elements underlying it. Clearly, there is another phenomena which has emerged quite significantly is, rather than have just north to south flows, we have south to south flows, which are almost 48 billion as of the latest figures, but I think it's slightly, 14.8 billion. It may be a little higher now. But others range in billions of dollars, for instance, remittances, and our colleague from the World Bank may give latest figure. I remember at a migration session I was there, it comes to about 500 billion. So I wanted to lay down some of the basic facts right here and then share with you, because we have a global partnership task force under the UN Technical Task Team that I've been handling, where we have been discussing on the way forward. I think the first thing we have done in that exercise is to actually draw lessons from the global partnerships as crystallized in the Millennium Development Goals number 8. Because it did help to create an environment conducive to development and elimination of poverty, which was the mission, and it did facilitate a number of things. But it was important, given the mixed results I talked about, to actually analyze the strengths and weaknesses of the present global partnerships. And in that context, we came up with some generic issues that I think need examination quite intensively. First of it is that clearly there are different shapes and forms of these partnerships with different types of governance structure, and some do not have a governance structure. Why is this an issue? Because we have been talking about corporate accountability. Similarly, we need accountability of partnerships. Architecture also needs to be looked at, their scope needs to be looked at, and also the quality of the involvement of the global multi-stakeholders is something that we think needs to be looked at. Desirable dimensions for new global partnership will need to include proposals and measures regarding, one, financing for sustainable development, which has been discussed quite a bit, debt, trade, and technology, engaging new and emerging actors and players, strengthening global governance, and strengthening global mutual accountability would be very important in the new dimensions. Building on the partnerships, present partnerships would be good because you can't start from scratch. International community as a first priority has to reaffirm and set clear timelines for achieving its ODA targets. Now I know this is a wishful thinking in the present environment, but this is what member states majority of the member states are pushing for. Part of these external resources have to be geared towards increasing the capacity of developing countries to mobilize domestic resources while also promoting good governance and combating capital flight. I think these are important because you just can't put in more international money and not have a real partnership and matching resources. A renewed partnership should also include improved mechanisms to reduce burden of external debt. It should further look to build a more equitable multilateral trade system, concluding the Doha round and addressing supply-side constraints, including through improved access to new technologies and to long-term investments. A renewed global partnership has to address weaknesses in international arrangements for collective decision-making, creating a more inclusive and equitable system of global governance. This all will help strengthen coherence within the global partnership and would contribute to creating an enabling environment for development. In conclusion, let me just mention something that we are currently thinking within United Nations as to how to create a hub for global partnership and to bring together on a platform private sector, philanthropic organization, and civil society to engage properly on the shared objectives. And the work that I'm talking about, I think will be soon available on the website for further deliberations, and I would very much welcome civil society's contribution, not only now, but also in submission of the comments going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Thomas, in this weekend, the heads of state of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are meeting.
Turkey.
And Turkey.
BRICS.
So the BRICS, I don't know what how to pronounce that anymore. They are supposed to be creating a BRICS development bank with some $50 or $60 billion as an initial capital. Is that threatening the role of the World Bank? How do you perceive it?
I think not at all. I think it's a great idea to get the emerging economies engaged in financing development. And as we all know, the challenge of development is far larger than any one institution alone can handle. So I think the more people and institutions that are involved, absolutely the better. So I don't see it as a threat at all. I welcome it.
And what is the World Bank doing about the partnership?
Well, I should say, first of all, your story on chimpanzees has me very confused. I don't know if I'm a product of evolution or devolution, or if I'm caught in some sort of paradigm shift. But I think, when you look forward to the partnerships for post-2015, it's always useful to look back a bit. And when we think of the time that the MDGs were discussed and agreed, this was a time of intense debates over structural adjustment and globalization. And the MDGs really helped put the human dimensions of development back into focus. And I think they've been tremendously successful in that regard. They've helped to shape donor policy, they've helped to shape government policy, and in some ways they've succeeded dramatically. It's widely acknowledged that we've achieved the goal of halving the number of people in extreme poverty, that many more people have access to water than they had 15 years ago. Progress on primary school enrollment has been good. Progress on gender parity in education has been achieved. There's still a very long way to go. MDGs 4 and 5 on maternal and child health are lagging. The women's economic empowerment still has much, much work to be done, and progress across the board in fragile and conflict states is really wanting. It's tempting for us to be proud of the achievements of the MDGs, but also remember that those goals were quite modest. Having the number of people in poverty still leaves 1.3 billion people below a poverty line of just $1.25 a day. I think the post-2015 agenda and development framework provides us a real opportunity to raise our ambitions, to address, as somebody said this morning, the needs of people and planet together. The MDGs just started to touch on issues of sustainability. The bank is thinking around goals of, well, I don't know if many of you have been in the bank. If you walk into the front door of the bank, there's a big sign that says, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." Our president doesn't actually like that. He says it shouldn't be a dream, it should be a reality. And so we should actually work for, we want to make it a reality, not a dream free of poverty. And our goals that we're trying to set are eradication of poverty and shared prosperity, meaning income growth of the bottom 40% of the population that exceeds the income growth, or it's faster than the income growth of the top 60%. And that this should be achieved at not at the cost of the environment, not at the cost of future generations in terms of excessive debt burdens. Setting those types of goals also is a statement about sort of an unwavering commitment to the current MDGs and need to complete them. This is the only by achieving those current MDGs will we have a strong basis for the post-2015 development framework. And the goal of promoting shared prosperity, if you start to unpack it, actually has a lot of actions required in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of leveling the playing field so that all individuals have their opportunity to maximize their human and their productive potential. The progress on the MDGs that we've seen in the last 15 years has been very closely linked to economic growth and to good policies and institutions. Institutions that are able to deliver on healthcare, on education, on water, and on sanitation. But stimulating growth and improving service delivery is really tricky business. And I think it's a goal that requires sort of all hands on deck to mobilize resources, to innovate in service delivery, and to ensure accountability of governments and institutions. And this becomes a real balancing act when we start to think about planetary boundaries, and when we start to think about reaching the most disadvantaged segments of the society, which are actually quite expensive to deliver services to. I would just say, maybe for the sake of this discussion, put a few principles forward on partnerships. I think, as Shamshad, as you said, the government, civil society, and the private sector all need to be part of the solution. Building a form of partnership that's qualitatively deeper view of the potential of each partner to contribute. The costing of the post-2015 development framework is fraught with difficulties. But I think what we know is that the costs are going to exceed the current capacity of governments and of aid agencies. There's no doubt about that in our minds. So we need to see some major innovations in finance and in policies on both the side of government and on the side of the international community. Governments to design targeted evidence-based policies about what works and what doesn't work, and to support effective institutions, to generate more revenues of their own. I think we had a colleague this morning note that the tax to GDP ratio in most developing countries is only about 10%. To ensure efficient public spending, we had a lot of references this morning about corruption and governance, and to promote financial deepening and inclusion so that people have the wherewithal to start their own businesses or to finance their needs when they hit a crisis. The international community needs to maximize the impact of ODA, manage their aid better, to support new development partners such as the BRICS, to leverage those resources coming in from the private sector, to tap new sources of financing. I think if you look around the world now, there are hundreds of billions of dollars in pension funds, in sovereign wealth funds that are actually earning negative interest rates around the world, while there are investment opportunities going for wanting in the developing countries. And most importantly, I think to be able to deliver on the global public goods. And I include in those goods not just environment, but also investments in youth. Third, I think information is really key. Building the statistical capacity of governments and bringing in new innovative sources of information is critically important to improving policies, to improving accountability, and to building our knowledge of what works and what doesn't work in delivering services. Innovations in areas such as natural capital accounting, new measures of poverty and inequality, and outcome measures for health, for education, and nutrition really have the potential to change the game in terms of decision-making frameworks. Fragile and conflict states present probably the biggest challenge. Few of them right now are meeting any of the MDGs, and none of them have met all of the MDGs. The internationally agreed peace and state-building goals are legitimate politics, we've heard that today, justice, security, economic foundations, and revenues and services. The nature of those goals themselves are a challenge to the international system to build new models of cooperation across political, economic, and security systems. And I think this is an opportunity, as your Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson has said, to legitimize multilateralism again. Finally, I think, it's coming from the bank, it's been interesting. I think in development, we've been able to think about economic sustainability. We've gone through a phase where we've thought about social sustainability, and we thought about environmental sustainability. We haven't yet been able to think about all those three concepts together. And that's our big challenge in the post-2015 development framework. The prospects of further social unrest, of growing inequality, of a 4-degree warming of the climate are forcing us to consider an agenda not only of how to reach the MDGs, but how to keep them. The environment, climate change alone could put a lot of our achievements at threat right now, as could political instability. So that's I think our big challenge is conceptually to bring that environment, social, and economic sustainability thinking together.
Thank you. Initial reactions. So we have a variety of issues on the table. Who wants to start? Mariama.
I can. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to step back a little bit, though, because I think I'm a little bit allergic or maybe resistant. I think there's far too much focus on the MDGs, and I don't want to reduce development to MDGs. I think development is a broader, more comprehensive approach than just the MDGs. Important though they are, and I realize that a lot of countries still need to do work on them. But if we just focus on the narrow goals or a set of MDGs, we'll be back in 10 years where we are, which is that part of what we should appreciate about the MDG is that it distorted the development trajectory. There was insufficient emphasis on building the productive capacities of developing countries, and insufficient work around creating employment and addressing some of the structural issues. So what is a post-2015? It's a development agenda. It's not an agenda about coming up with 6 or 7 goals. Those are part of it. I don't think it's even sufficient. So So what is development, and what is the issue of development? I think we have to look at development and underdevelopment, which is what we're talking about here. I'll come to global development in a minute. It's really about a series of gaps that we have in developing countries: productivity gap, technological gap, financial gap, infrastructural gaps, and a whole bunch of social gaps that arises from those. So an approach to post-2015 must be about promoting economic development that, of course, is sustainable, because we cannot develop on the same model as the previous epoch, and it must be gender-sensitive and focus on poverty eradication and eliminating inequality. So for me, the starting point has to be the broader framework of the Millennium Declaration, which is a lot broader than focusing on these narrow goals. So, and in that context, we need to reconceptualize how we think about the economy and how we think about things like government spending and the efficiency of it. We need to see public investment not as expenditure, but as actually building infrastructure that will enable poverty, enable poor and underserved people to have access to water, sanitation, and so forth. So we need to really think about that. The other dimension of reconceptualizing the economy is that we need to think about the role of women and the care economy, and the making sure that the household and care economy is integrated into fiscal, monetary, trade policy dimensions and looking at those issues. So a lot of thinking, I think, need to go around to be done before we start elaborating a set of goals that put us on a trajectory that leads us right back to where we are in a couple of years. I think the role of the global partnership really is to facilitate development, right? And to facilitate development, not to kick away the ladder. What we see, and what I see from where I am, watching climate change, trade, and even talking about the financial crisis, is that developed countries, having developed, are now kicking away the ladder, so that developing countries cannot follow that path in terms of intellectual property right, in terms of narrow and restrictive trade agreement, in terms of investment agreement that are tying governments and preventing them from using those paths. So global partnership has to be about allowing developing countries to be able to experiment. There is not one way to development, there are multiple paths, and developing countries need to be able to experiment and use a diverse way, and they need to have regulations in their own, and also the international regulatory system needs to be reformed in terms of financial regulation. One key aspect of it, beyond what was discussed here, is of course taxation. We've seen that taxation is one of the newly positioned part of the international architecture, financial architecture, that high net worth individuals and multinationals are increasing tax avoidance behavior, which is leaching almost $700 to $1,380 billion away from developing countries, which far exceed the amount of money they receive in ODA. So it's critical that the regulatory apparatus be changed, in addition to the trade rule. And it's not just about completing the Doha agenda. We want a fair trade system. We want an agenda that goes back to the 2001, which is a development agenda. So it's not just, people like to talk about completing Doha. What is the nature of the agenda that we're completing? It's one where we eliminate agricultural subsidies in the north, and we foster the development of the LDCs and their access to intellectual property and also medicine, which is now a big struggle inside the WTO. Last week, the developed countries as a group blocked what was a position by all developing countries to support the extension of trips for LDCs for a long time. I'll stop.
Yeah,
yes.
That's a lot.
Sorry.
Please stop there. Really a lot. Ruth, you want to pick up?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do is try and reflect back some of the key things that have got me fired up at this conference, things that I've heard from you over the last few days, and think about how as civil society we can take that forward as part of a global partnership. So what I've heard here is that there's a strong consensus that environmental sustainability and development are part of the same agenda, and that is incredibly exciting, and it's a major shift from where we were with the MDGs. But I would also challenge us that we are in a little bit of a bubble here, and that we still need to make that case when we go back at a national level, and also bring the rest of the civil society with us so they understand that environment and development are part of the same issue. As Beyond 2015, we have a vision that integrates environment and development. It's for an equitable and sustainable world where every person is safe, resilient, lives well, and enjoys their human rights. It's a world where political and economic systems deliver well-being for all people within the limits of our planet's resources. But if we look outside this room, if we look outside, what have we got? It's a world that's a very long way from achieving that vision. We have a political and economic system that is bringing huge wealth to a few people and poverty to many. We have a system that degrades and exploits on environmental resources, and by doing so is damaging the prospects for future generations. Our systems are broken. They're delivering us an unequal and degraded world. Climate change, as I'm sure Wael will come on to talk about, is the biggest example of a market failure that you have. And who's paying the cost for that market failure? It's the poorest people in the poorest places. And who's paying the costs of resource degradation, pollution, overexploitation of resources like fisheries? Again, it's the poorest people in the poorest places. For me, one of the biggest take-homes from this conference is around inequality. Inequality is growing rather than reducing, and a post-2015 framework needs to tackle the root causes of inequality. We need a framework that restores social justice and tackles extremes of wealth as well as extremes of poverty, like we heard from our Latin American colleagues, and that it tackles overconsumption as well as underconsumption. It needs to address the redistribution of wealth and power and access to natural resources. So when we talk about a post-2015 agenda that's transformative and going to deliver change, we need to actually look at the structures, the institutions, the processes in our political and economic systems that are perpetuating inequality and unsustainable resource use. And this includes looking at our trade system, our financial systems, how capital flows around the world. It's challenging vested interests. It's challenging tax regimes and the way in which subsidies are set up to support fossil fuels, for example. This brings me to the issue of governance and implementation. We have a huge glaring governance gap that nobody seems to be talking about. We already have a multitude of goals and targets. Take the Human Rights Convention. If it was actually implemented, that in itself would be genuinely transformative. The same that could be said of the Millennium Declaration, that I'm sure you all know and is a fantastic bit of writing. We also have around 500 multilateral environmental agreements, but none of these agreements or conventions are delivering the change that we need. Why? Because we don't have the robust accountability mechanisms in place. So we have to be talking about governance in this discussion. We have to be talking about accountability. And unless we address that, even if we come out with a beautiful framework that we all agree and looks wonderful, it would still fail at the end of the day. I was very, very moved this morning when Rosa from Papua New Guinea and Ninette from the Philippines were talking about the destructive force that corporations are having in their communities. And a post-2015 framework needs to include mechanisms to hold to account the private sector and corporations as well as governments. And I think that the formal discussions that are going to take place at Bali need to account for this potentially poisonous element of the private sector as well as the promising element of the private sector. So with this new framework, we have a chance to think outside the box. We need to think differently. Another world is possible. We have to define progress in ways that go beyond GDP and economic growth. At the moment, if you cut a forest down, even if that forest is providing water and other services, your GDP actually goes up. So we need to measure progress in ways that go beyond this and include safety. They include happiness, quality of life, and environmental integrity. As civil society, there's some tangible things we can do going forward from this conference. We have one planet and one future, and we need to articulate and describe what that future looks like. We need to be ambitious and visionary. We have to be leaders, not followers. We need to challenge inequality, injustice, and corruption in all its forms. And we need to work together in new partnerships that get us beyond our sectoral sectors and the divisions around environment and development is not relevant anymore. We need to get beyond that. And if we are going to have a system that is genuinely transformative, we need to go beyond tweaking the edges of a system. We need to get beyond bits of paper fed into formal consultation processes. We need a movement and a social and political movement that drives change, and that has to come from civil society. There was a lot of anger and passion in this plenary session yesterday afternoon that I don't necessarily think is feeding through and influencing the formal UN processes in this negotiation. And I think we need to capture and harness that when we go forward from here tonight. We need to go with a strong message about why the post-2015 agenda matters, that can articulate what it actually is and how it impacts people in their lives every day and the impact of their future. future children. So we need to go home getting active, getting angry, and making sure that people are mobilized and care about this agenda. Thank you.
Good. I'm coming to you, Wael, but first, is the World Bank ready to change GDP as the main definition of development or of poverty?
Well, there's a lot of work actually on new measures of inequality, measures of opportunity, and what we call the multi-dimensional measures of poverty that take into account things like a sense of justice, a sense of well-being, access to healthcare, access to education. The trick is, you know, when you have these index measures, sometimes it's hard to disaggregate exactly where the problem is. So I think the lesson for me is you have a lot of clear indicators and achieve balance in the way you interpret them. And I think the big issue on GMP is the big advance that we saw come out of Rio is the push towards natural wealth accounting. That's significant. And we had about 80 countries sign up and say they want to be a part of natural wealth accounting, which means you just don't count the income you receive, but you subtract from that the degradation or the assets that you remove in the development process. That, as I said earlier, has the potential to really transform decision-making. It's a huge task to implement. We've been trying to get countries to measure GDP alone for 50 years. And I would say, Shamsa, if you agree with me, only about half of the poor countries can actually measure that accurately now. The statistical capacity is incredibly important, not only for getting the right measures, but, as people have said, for holding governments and institutions accountable and for getting the right decision-making frameworks in place. So yes, there's much more to development than GMP. Big statistical challenges, and I guess the challenge is always to be able to interpret and measure and balance goals.
Can I add something to this?
Well, but
okay, well,
hey, climate, it's a minor thing that we have to deal with before we go on, yes?
There's a lot of expectation for me to talk about climate change. I wasn't actually, but don't worry, I will not disappoint everyone. I'll definitely talk about climate change. But what I really want to talk about, since the topic is partnership, I want to challenge the people who are in the room who are mainly from civil society. And one of the things that I've noticed that what we need also in terms of partnership is changing within the civil society movement a lot. We definitely talk about breaking the silos and interlinkages a lot, but still I think there's a long way for us as civil society that we need to do to actually really do it and work together in a coherent way. And I think it's not about only about understanding the interlinkages, how climate change relates to poverty, but actually also understanding the struggles and the concerns and the problems and feeling it. I've seen in this conference, we talked about it a lot, but then there's a lot of signs that we still go in the same silos and the same discussions that we had before. And it became a bit worrying for us in the approach we're going from now till 2015 at this period of time. For example, even the statements that, and I'm trying to be provocative to stimulate the discussion later on, and the interventions that were brought here, we talk about the poverty and sustainability are the same problem, but then we say that we need to solve poverty in a sustainable way. By saying this, you're still separating the two issues, that it is possible to eliminate poverty without sustainability or with sustainability. And this is the thinking that we're trying to change. You will not eliminate poverty or solve any other problem without sustainability. Now the challenge is completely different how we perceived it 20 years ago, that one problem is increasing the problem in another place. So climate change, for example, now I'm going to go to the climate change as everyone is expecting. If we don't solve climate change, we'll not eliminate poverty. Already, many scientists think that we lost the 1.5 temperature target. And some scientists already think that already we lost the 2 degrees temperature target that was agreed politically in the UNFCCC. This has definitely increased poverty with maybe hundreds of millions. If we lose the 2 degrees target completely and the 3 degrees and we go to the 4 degrees as the World Bank says, we're going to lose completely poverty goal and will never achieve anything else. And it's the same way, the other way around. If we don't solve poverty, we cannot expect anyone to think about reducing emissions. When you're hungry or when you're thirsty, you can never think about reducing emissions. You become so desperate for the day-by-day survival that we'll never address anything else. And this is how we need to approach it, that let's call it only one thing, elimination of poverty. And if you come and you want to really eliminate poverty, you realize that climate change is one of the issues you need to solve, that you need to solve gender equality problems. And all of these will come under this agenda. We call it sustainable development to try to combine it, but so far we didn't succeed in doing so completely. Another thing I want to talk about, that this 5 years we have to realize that will determine actually if we're going to achieve it, yes or no. And I don't think we'll have another opportunity. We're in an interesting time where our generation actually is going to determine the survival of future generations. That's it. Okay? And future generations are going to look at us as the generation that are their heroes who made it happen, or the generation why they're living in this really nasty conditions. So everyone who has children, and we have a little baby in this room, it's really frustrating, I think, for parents to believe or to comprehend that if we continue on this path, there's no way the children are going to enjoy the same quality of life, and actually it's going to be very miserable. So in the coming 3 years, there are two important processes. There's the post-2015 development agenda, and there's the UNFCCC process, which is going to agree on hopefully a new treaty or agreement or deal in 2015 as well. And the agreement is going to be 2 months far away from each other. September is the development, and in December is the climate summit in Paris. If we lose one of them, we're not going to achieve anything. So we have to succeed in both of them. And this is something very important for civil society to make sure that both succeed and open up and understand how we can link with each other on this. So before taking the partnership to outside stakeholders, the private sector and others, we need to really fix the partnership within civil society in order to achieve this and know how we approach the rhetoric. One other rhetoric I think we need to address is what also was mentioned in the interventions in relation to development in developing countries. One thing that came out a lot here, that we need development in developed and developing countries. So redefining development, so it's GDP change is not the right measure of development. That means what we already term developed countries might not be developed according to what the new definition of development is. For example, if you look at sustainable consumption patterns, then we definitely need to reconsider which country is developed and which country is developing. We need to look intra-country. So even if the GDP is high or low, as long as there are poor people in the richest country, there is development issues in that country. So each country, that's when we talk about universality of goals, that all countries, the goals should apply to all countries and intra-country specifically. And it should be the fight between developed and developing individuals rather developed and developing countries. If we consider that within one country there are development issues and developing issues. So this should reflect on our approach as the final thing, as civil society. We cannot do the same talk we said 20 years ago, and we cannot campaign the same way and say the same thing. We need to change radically not only our rhetoric and discussions, but also our ideas and ideologies and how we think. Are we trying to fight the white whale, where we try to get something, or we understand that we are all together in this problem and that we are all down or up? And this is what's interesting in climate change, that now the threat is not only for the poor. The threat is on all of us, rich and poor. And this is good, especially for the poor, because it made the rich realize that these problems is not they're trying to help someone else, but also they need to save themselves and their future generations.
Thanks for that. Now, Mariama, explain to me, as an economist, if the rich countries start to consume less to save the planet, will that not hurt us developing countries that lose our markets?
Ooh, you don't pull your punches, huh? I will answer your question, but I actually want a point to respond, because I think it's really important that when we think about reconceptualizing GDP, I think we have to go a bit deeper and wider than just including natural wealth. I think we have to include into it issues of measuring care work, issues of looking at time use, of what, and how those are burdened by the policy changes or by the way that policy are made, so that even with climate change imposes more burden on the poor, more burden on women. And until we can see that the care economy is the foundation of the economy and the work that men and women do in care for society, and measure that. Because what you measure, you value. And what you value, you put resources in. So as long as we continue to ignore a substantial part of what constitutes the economy, we will never actually get that right. And actually, when you do that, you might actually find lots of shifting in terms of who's wealthy, who's poor, and what's going on. So I want to just throw that in, because I think we need to be very clear about that. The question of consumption and how we deal with climate change. I think climate change, as everybody has pointed out, is a significant issue. It's one of the most potent issues about inequality and injustice that we have, that confronts us today. And it really requires global cooperation. What we've seen, and one of the reasons why the UNFCCC process is bogged down, is that reality hasn't really sunk home to many negotiators and to many governments. We still have, the fact is that climate change impacts the lives of poor people and developing countries a lot more than developed countries. That when a same event or a similar event occurs in a developing country, it's more loss of life, and almost 70% of our infrastructure gets destroyed because it's not that great to begin with. Whereas the same event or similar event occur in New York or whatever, it's infrastructure and the loss of lives. And so climate change impacts all of us, but not the same. It's,
no.
Yeah, in that moment, not the same. So we will all have impacts, but it's very different from where you start and where you're located. So that the reality is who has to take charge. And within the context of our discussion, we need to look at the historical responsibility of developed countries, because the scientific fact is that we have a climate problem because of the stock of greenhouse gases that presently exist, which is like an accumulation of their development processes. And that's why in the convention, they took the responsibility for, first of all, cleaning up their economies and cleaning the path and reducing consumption and so forth, and then also supporting developing countries through providing finance and technology transfer, something which, over the last 5 years, they have been persistently moving away from, which is why it's deadlock. If developed countries stop consuming, of course we'll have a challenge. The problem is to reorient economies so that we look at different ways and different measures of the economy and different kinds of lifestyle, and also promote development, clean energy development, clean kinds of consumer that poor people in developing countries can have, the basic dignity of life. And then you have a whole rebalancing of the distribution of resources and everything.
Okay, I'm sure many people want to jump in. Yes? So, please.
Thank you all for these constructive statements, but I would like to comment maybe on the statement of Mr. Wael Ahmedan. We are friends and we are from the same neighborhood and we work together on climate change. In fact, so I understood Wael that he tries to link fighting or reducing, as I said yesterday, poverty with decreasing putting a limit how to fight climate change at 2 degrees Celsius from now on. And as the World Bank now is looking for a higher limit, which is 4 degrees, not only 2 degrees. So the financial help that should go to fighting poverty should be reduced in order to fight climate change impacts. So I understood from Wael. I think poverty is there before climate change has took place in this universe, or in this, I mean, on the face of this earth. As we know, if we go back maybe 20, 30 years, the temperature started to raise little by little. Until now, we have already got 1.5 degrees above average. So, and maybe by the end of this century, you are going to reach maybe 3, 4, and some scientists say about or talk about 5 degrees. Does it mean that we have to stop helping the poor in order to fight climate change? This is a completely different issue. Climate change is caused by rich countries. We know that very well. And when these rich countries, without naming any country of them right now, we know that, for example, they do mining in the country of Mozambique in Africa in order to find copper or aluminum or whatever kind of natural resources. Or this country now digging in the areas of Brazil in order to cut so much trees. So this is at the expense of oxygen. And of course, this reduce the amount of trees that take the carbon dioxide, and it is a natural mechanism to improve. Just a few minutes, yeah? So I think these rich countries who are digging for oil and who are digging for mining and who have caused this huge damage to the environment and to the climate. So they have to take responsibility without affecting the help, the financial help that be given to the poor in terms of fighting poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really hate to interrupt anybody. I know how important it is to have an occasion to have a voice, but time is a very scarce resource that we have to try to share as fairly as possible. Yes, please, the lady back there. And introduce yourself.
Yes. Hello to everyone. I'm Monica. I work with Centro Humboldt in Nicaragua. While I was listening to your discussion, I thought about doing some reality check. So I went to the computer of my boss, who is sitting to my side. And I found an important information that talks about people and not about countries. And this is that if we were the 250 people attending to this meeting, if these 250 people were the richest people in the world, we would have an annual income that represents 45% of the whole people living in poverty. So I wonder, if we were these 250 richest people, would we be asking ourselves, the world is developing badly? I'm not sure how to answer that question because I come from Nicaragua and I'm an ordinary worker, but what I can ask to the group is, are we going really to be able to eradicate poverty when we do not establish in the United Nations framework and in the job that the World Bank does, if we do not establish goals, targets, indicators, measures, statistical capacity, as you said, to limit the concentration of richness? Because we always talk about what we need to do with the millions of people living in poverty. What do we have to do with those 250 people living in complete richness? I would like to see in the future, I hope it's in the short future, that we also discuss what do we have to do about those people so that we could actually have an answer to the sustainable development question. Thank you.
Yes, you have the floor.
Hi there. Just to reiterate what Monica was saying, actually.
Please introduce yourself.
Sorry, Helen Dennis from Christian Aid. Inequality and income inequality in particular has been such a key theme through the last 3 days, and it's been coming out in every single statement. And I think we really need to send a strong message to those on the high-level panel and member states and the World Bank that when you're thinking about shared prosperity, yes, let's think about the bottom 40%, but let's also think about the top 10, top 1% as well, because without that action on inequality, these measures and focus on eradication of poverty are going to feel quite limited to people who are living and feeling socially excluded. The one other thing I wanted to mention, I was quite surprised that there was no mention of tax from UNDESA. I know Mariana mentioned it in her presentation, but it seems to me to be one of the areas where global partnerships and cooperation is most needed at the moment. We have a situation, as was explained, where foreign direct investment is increasing, and yet countries are not able to translate that into revenues, taxation revenues. And the Tax Justice Network estimate that there's $11.5 trillion held offshore at the moment. If we're thinking about financing for development going forward, and I hope this will be on the agenda in Bali, we really need to think about tax haven secrecy. We really need to think about how we can support countries to mobilize domestic revenues and mobilize taxation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Patrick from Justice and Peace in Nigeria, member of Beyond 2015. I just want the members of the panel to educate me a little more. They say information, the way it is collected and shared and presented may have some ideological coloration. I'm so used to hearing about how much money people from Africa who come to live in Europe send back. My concern is, are they just harvesting without ever planting anything? Is there any way I can know how much they produce locally as wealth for the countries where they live before they can repatriate the 500 billions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
From Greenpeace International. Mr. Thomas, I was a little surprised, maybe I didn't understand correctly, but I was a little surprised to hear you say that the World Bank is only just starting to look at the integration of economic, environment, and social dimensions. I mean, that's what we spent 2 years in the run-up to Rio talking about. And so maybe I misunderstood. And Ms. Akhtar, on the role of global partnerships that you described, I think you were referring to when it was agreed by the UN, but of course that was something that emerged at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Joburg, which actually was a convenient device for the rich countries to say, we don't really want to do anything that's legally binding, but we have this great new idea of how we can all work together. And so this has become a substitute for doing what the world actually needs. And now I'm just a little bit disturbed. If we're talking about a paradigm shift and we're talking about partnerships as being the core of the way we work, that's not really what we're asking for, talking about, or demanding. Partnerships, voluntary partnerships are fine if they're like the dessert or the icing on the cake, but that's not the core of what is needed to save the planet and the people. So.
Thank you. I'm taking. How many? 2, 3. Please be brief. Yeah.
Thank you, Roberto. I was afraid you will not look behind you because you are used only to look straight forward. So I'm Ziad from the Arab NGO Network for Development. I have two quick questions or comments. First, I was amazed by hearing the World Bank thinking from now on the costing of the post-2015 agenda while we are still here thinking about the framework and the paradigm, which is giving a very good, idea about how the bank thinks about the whole thing. My real comment here is related to how we can finance the post agenda, focusing on the governance issue. And taking into consideration, governance is raised as if to be a national concern, while it is also related to the systemic, to the global system. The main corruption or corrupted system is related to the international relation. The way privatization went was not only a national matter, but it was also kind of a trend, and these, I mean, connected people, high-level political responsible, who were responsible for selling the premises, the public premises, were highly internationally connected, and then they have reached high, let's say, positions at the international institutions who are mainly responsible to hold the governments accountable. So this is something that we have to take into consideration when we are talking about governance. Governance is not only the national level. My second concern is the way how Wael described the relation between poverty and sustainability, where I think that the raisonnement behind it was not politically very well correct, because who is the polluter and who is responsible really for what's happening at the level of the climate change and threatening the sustainability? In this way of thinking, it is as if the poor are responsible for the pollution, while most of the pollution are deriving from the industrialized countries, from the rich. So definitely there is a common, but it is differential responsibility, and this principle should be always taken into consideration when we are talking about sustainability.
Thank you, Siad. I have at least 10 more people that have questions to ask, so let me go back to the panel and have 1 minute each replies, and then we can go back for a brief interventions from the floor. Yes, we want to speed this up. So let's take the same order.
Well, thank you. I think what we heard around here is still the debate around the development agenda. And I think there is no dispute about that. I thought the session was global partnership, and that's why I was selectively giving comments on global partnership. Two things came out from the debates as I saw. People are quite passionately stuck to the agendas that they have been working on. As far as we are concerned, we are looking at development agenda in a very broad sense, as has been discussed around this table. So I don't see any major disagreements on that. Now, there was a question that was raised by Madam here regarding the global partnerships, and I don't think global partnership is there to just resolve all the development. I mean, that was not the objective. Global partnerships are a form and modality of coming together on a certain common purpose and to deliver more effectively and efficiently. And as I said, there have been successful cases, there have not been that many successful cases. But bottom line is that it is a modality, it's clearly not a substitute of an integrated development agenda. It can be applied in certain contexts, for certain purposes. So I just thought that this session was more about global partnership, as the title said. However, we ended up scratching still the old debates of development, which we've been discussing for 3.5 days out here. And nobody says we need to reach an agreement on this, but I think it would be good to focus on the subject itself of global partnership and give some feedback and thought from your side, because clearly it is a modality that could be used, and nobody's saying it has to be absolutely used under all circumstances. So I was just trying to comment on this. Now, there was another point that came on statistical issues. I think there's a lot of work to be done on statistics. But based on the existing statistical databases, we still have a lot of inferences and a lot of development questions which have not been resolved. So I think either we divert these debates into, how to fix the statistics, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done on statistics. In United Nations, as you are probably aware of, we have Statistical Commission, and it has convened the chief statistical heads of different institutions to come to United Nations and agree on an agenda for statistical reforms, which includes the revision of the national accounts, to make it more sophisticated and more realistic with the issues we have at hand. We are talking about environmental accounting. We're talking about how to augment and enhance labor statistics, the employment statistics. So there's a whole exercise that's going on. I think it's a global exercise, not just United Nations. It's just that United Nations provides the platform for harmonizing the standards and also creating more innovation into statistical measurements. So, but that, by having even the right statistics or more elaborate statistics, the development realities will not change. We do know there is poverty. We do know there is environmental issues. They have been measured. You could probably get more precision in it. So I think we have to segment the debates here a little bit, as I felt in what I heard across the table.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
This has been a really interesting discussion. As I sat through this morning as well, I've had the privilege of being in the high-level panel meetings in Monrovia and a series of other meetings in Rio and aid debates and so forth. And, as Mark Twain said, you see the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think there's a heck of a lot more good than there is the bad or the ugly. And what I hear people struggling with are the very same concepts that were raised here around what's the appropriate measure of poverty? How do we deal with inequality? How do we create a more just world? How do we deal with issues of sustainability? I think what people are really thirsty for are solutions, and that's where the partnership comes in, and that's where the knowledge that all of your organizations have and the creative ideas and the energy that you have to either bring new information to the table or bring ideas to the table that would really change things and add up to a series of steps that would actually change the world is what's really important. I think you mentioned fossil fuel subsidies. This is a win-win. The world, developing countries alone spend $409 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. They're called subsidies, but only 8% of that money goes to the bottom 20% of the population. So it's not really a subsidy for the poor. Are there better ways of helping poor people? Is taxing carbon or eliminating fossil fuel subsidies a win for the environment? I think that's got to be, that's clear. Educating girls. What more could you do to change, think of educating women, especially in Africa, and the impact that would have on human rights, on the distribution of income, on the health and welfare of the next generation, on fairness and justice, and on politics. This is a complete, obvious thing to invest in. I think we need a series of these things, and we need the people, the resources in this room to help bring solutions. I don't hear much disconnect in terms of the big concepts and the vision and the way people want to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's been really quite...
Okay, but let me just give 1 minute to the other panelists then. Yes.
It's been really quite a good discussion. Just 2 points. I think part of the reason why you keep hearing the debate, and it may be old, and it may be, is because it never gets resolved. And it never gets resolved because, as was pointed out by Ruth, we have lots of solutions on the table, but they're not implemented.
Give me one solution on global partnership. I gave you the background. Give me one solution on how we can fix the global partnership for you.
0.7%?
No, yeah, well, that is the point. That is a
part
point
of
I've
that.
raised.
It's the agreement the G20 made to eliminate fossil fuel, not implemented. It's within climate change, the global agreement that we have a global problem and climate finance is a global public good, and that the developed countries would in fact feed through in the mechanism of the convention to help developing countries. They haven't done that. In fact, the Green Climate Fund that we spent almost a year designing had its third board meeting last week, and the only innovative things that could come up, which is the same thing I hear about global partnership right now, the major transformative element is the private sector. The private sector, without any attempt to define what the private sector is or to evaluate its behavior and the way it moves forward. And that's been the transformative element I see also being proposed within this new development agenda, public-private partnership. So there are many multiple situations where we have the environmental agreement, we have the UNFCCC, and so forth. But
Mariama,
yeah,
point
sorry,
is
let
cut
us
us off. Sorry. I would really hope we could continue, but I'm being told that we have to finish this panel right here because we have with us the Vice Minister that is going to make our closing speech. Isn't that so, Bernadette? Okay, back to you, and thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
There are people who commented related to
I
I need to respond
know.
to this. It cannot happen.
Yeah?
Yeah.
15 seconds?
Well, one sentence. Just want to say something related to the minute we've decided to intervene in the process, we became equally responsible to anyone else in the success of the process. As NGOs, if it fails, it's easy for us to go say, those are the reason and be angry. But we have to know, the minute we became players, and we do influence opinions and positions of countries, we as civil society, the failure that we do is the failure of everyone. So what I want to say, what I talked is about ideological reasons. It's not related to the organization I came from or the baggage that you put to a person related to history. In terms, when I talked about the link between poverty and climate change is to combine the movements. I'm focusing about civil society. It's not on the political between the rich countries and the poor countries. No, we agree. So why I'm mentioning this, because we need to come in a winning strategy, not ideological positions. We need to come with a strategy that makes change. So we agree we want to change the position of certain countries, make them pay, mainly the developed countries as identified in the annexes. What is our strategy in doing this? And what can deliver, not only in positions in the UNFCCC, but mobilizing on the ground, what would deliver? What would move, for example, the US from its position? We suggested some ideas, kicking the US ambassadors from 10 developing countries because they didn't deliver on their promises in the UNFCCC. No one was ready to campaign on this. Then we need to find another strategy. If we're not able to deliver this, we need to find another strategy.
We cannot give Ruth the same time to you, and that would be very unfair, not gender sensitive. So please, end the panel with a phrase.
Okay, I don't think we should be talking about the term partnerships without also discussing power. Power is really important within partnerships, right from the household level up. If you look at relationships between men and women at a household level, that is not an equal relationship. We need to be talking about power there. If we're talking about power and relationships between countries, that's not an equal relationship. We need to be talking about power there. If we look about relationships between public and private sector, that's not always an equal relationship. We need to be talking about power dynamics there. So I think we definitely need to be talking about power whenever we talk about partnerships. And secondly, if we were the 200 wealthiest people in this room out of all the world, it's definitely much more convenient for us to be talking about poverty than it is about extreme wealth. So perhaps some of the reasons that people focus so much on the poverty angle is because it doesn't directly challenge vested interests. So there you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your patience. I think that's been a very rich discussion, and we have to clear the floor and give Bernadette the floor. And
thank you very much. Now it's getting really interesting, but it's also time to close. I think it's quite clear that we all agree that if we want to tackle poverty, we also have to tackle wealth. And I'm not sure if it goes without saying, or whether it should be especially mentioned that that needs to happen also taking into regard environmental sustainability. However, I have now the honor to welcome Hans-Jürgen Beerfels, the State Secretary of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. In German, it's much shorter, the BMZ, to share with us his closing remarks on behalf of the host. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm really sorry for interrupting this lively discussion, but on behalf of the German government, I have to say thank you to all of you for participating in this, in our mind, very important conference. And I was told that we all had 3 very inspiring days. I want to look back a little bit, what have we achieved, but I also want to look ahead. What are the major challenges of the post-2015 agenda? However, I would like to start by highlighting the importance of the Millennium Development Goals. We are discussing a new international agenda now. We are doing that because we want to continue the success story of the MDGs. Yes, it is a success story in many ways. The MDGs have focused the work of the international community on measurable results, and in many areas, a lot of progress has been made. Poverty has been reduced, access to safe drinking water has improved, and child mortality has declined. But that is not enough, and we have not made progress in all areas. So we need to and we will continue our efforts to still achieve the goals by 2015. And we need your strong support for that, and maybe also some of the pressure you are able to create. However, the MDGs also have considerable weaknesses. There are areas that they do not cover, and they did not emerge from a process that was based on participation. This time, we want to make sure that we do things differently. We are strongly committed to this approach. An inclusive process led by the United Nations is needed. Only then will the new set of goals have the necessary legitimation. The United Nations is the only international institution that can define norms and targets that are binding for all countries. Neither the G8 nor the G20 could ever do this. We have to avoid that the power of the United Nations will be replaced by summits that are more or less democracy-free zones. It is certainly true that the United Nations is involved in a multitude of operations in the field. Here we think it is necessary and possible to enhance its effectiveness. In many areas, there's still too much red tape and too little impact on the ground. I am well aware that UN reform is difficult to achieve, but we must continue to push for it because we all need a stronger United Nations. Only the United Nations can make sure that the concerns of all countries and all major stakeholders are taken into account. The concerns of governments, parliaments, academia, and the private sector, and of course, the concerns of civil society. Civil society can make a really big difference, where the people themselves look for ways of improving their situation. They often come up with excellent ideas, and global action across national borders builds bridges between societies, and that is why cooperation with civil society is in our mind of fundamental importance. We have done a lot to support NGO participation in international processes. For instance, we in Germany organized meetings before the 2010 MDG summit in New York, before the aid effectiveness meeting in Busan, and before the Rio Plus 20 conference last year. And we also regularly invite NGOs to exchange views with us on our positions for the G20 Development Working Group, and we in Germany were part of the initiative to give NGOs an official voice at Rio Plus 20. And it is our wish to increasingly make them an official part of the national delegations at international conferences. For the post-2015 agenda, civil society organizations have already been able to raise their concerns at 11 thematic and more than 60 national consultations all around the world. They have also been able to voice their interests in consultations with a high-level panel of the Eminent Persons Group, Federal President Horst Köhler's keynote speech at this conference maybe showed you how much importance the panel attaches to civil society involvement. And there's an important reason for that, because governments alone cannot meet the challenges. For better results, for more effectiveness, and for the mobilization of additional resources, we need a new triangle. We need to combine government initiative better with private sector and civil society activities. In addition, there are many online consultations. Ours ends today, an online project called World We Want DE. We created that together with UNICEF. On that website, we have been asking young people to tell us about the world they want to live in. But the many different views of civil society, of course, need to be recorded and compiled. As we all know, one important question is the following: what are civil society's most important concerns for the post-2015 agenda? And obviously, it is not the government's job to answer this question. That's exactly what this conference was all about. It provided space for the diversity of civil society voices. It made clearer where we have common ground and also where we have differences. The strategic demands that we have talked about in the last few days have given us many new and inspiring ideas. This is, in my mind, a very fruitful basis for our further work. I want to thank you very much for your input, particularly those of you traveled a long way to get here. I also want to thank the Berlin Civil Society Center and the steering committee again for doing such a great job in organizing this big conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me another 2 minutes. I would like to list 3 points which German development policymakers consider important with regard to the international negotiation processes. And we want to invite you to support us in this, to share your ideas, and to give us your critical feedback. Firstly, the post-MDG process needs to be closely linked with the Sustainable Development Goals. In the end, we want a single coherent agenda. The international goals should address all major aspects of inclusive and sustainable development, such as ecological sustainability and good governance. They should define a minimum standard for better living conditions. And at the same time, I think they should take the limited resources of our planet better into account. Secondly, the goals should be specific and measurable, and they should be achievable within a reasonable period of time. Unlike the MDGs, the new goals should focus more on results. One key challenge is, of course, how to make the goals realistic and ambitious at the same time. Thirdly, the goals should be measured on a global scale and should apply to all countries. And at the same time, they should be country-specific so that they provide clearer guidance for action for all those involved. We need innovation, we need people who take action, people who dare to try new things. And that is why we called our development policy strategy in Germany Minds for Change. The existing MDGs tend to divide development into separate issues. We now need to put the individual human being in the center. We need to create more opportunities for people to improve their own living conditions, for instance, more jobs for the young, and we need to think more about the links between different sectors, such as the nexus between food, energy, and water. We need a more holistic approach. On the 25th of May, we will be holding the first ever German Development Day. There will be stage programs in more than 15 German cities at the same time. There will be an Africa festival in Berlin, and there will be a live TV show. In this way, we want to encourage the general public to get more involved. We need more people helping to build a better world. Ladies and gentlemen, we will only be able to meet the challenges facing us if we all pull together. Policymakers, the private sector, and civil society need to improve their cooperation. Only together will we be able to design effective development policies that are really fit for the future. Based on our 2012 slogan for German development cooperation, you all are very warmly invited to be future makers. We are trying to build the future. Let us join forces, join us in developing the future. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and a safe trip back. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Many thanks for your closing remarks. Really appreciate that. Thank you. We've come to the close of the 3 days. I just wanted to go back. Now is obviously not the time to go back into discussions, but just one thought that came to me. I started the meeting by saying that I see wherever I travel, particularly in India, I see a strong narrative of anger. I'm glad that that narrative of anger is getting reflected here also. In fact, it's robust, and I am fairly confident, listening to what I've heard over the last 3 days, that that would really shape the aspirations that we have and shape the world we want. I think that, and that shaping, the words that are constantly humming back are inequality, human rights, and I must say the highlight of the 3 days that we have had the slogans what we heard this morning. So thank you for that also. So justice for all, and then like Roberto said, maybe it's good to also understand the erotic justice part. So a big thanks to all of you. It's important that we close the session with special thanks. A very, very special thanks to the BMZ, Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We also express our thanks to UN DESA. We are also very, very grateful to the members of the steering committee. I think they've done a fantastic job, and it's been a lot of work over the past 3-4 months. I think a big hand for all of them. A big thanks to our speakers, contributors, and I would also like to extend our thanks to the City of Bonn, Value Web, and Doppler. A special thanks, obviously, to Lab Concepts, Ms. Betten Koffer and her team, and also the team at the Bonn Conference Center. So again, maybe I think we should clap for them. Obviously not last and not the least, a very, very big thanks to the people who made this happen, Berlin Civil Society Center. And I just wanted to specifically take a few names. I'm sure I'll not be able to take the names of all the people who have put in immense amount of work over the last few weeks, last few months, particularly Joachim, Michael, I don't know if they're here. A very, very big thanks. I've been constantly interacting with Sarah. I hope she's here. And also to Burkhard. Thank you, Burkhard. Finally, I think a very big thanks due to all of you who have come from across the world. Really long journeys, but you've come and participated very, very actively. So thank you to all of you. Before we end the session, I just wanted to make one request, and that is to go back to your kids, identify the evaluation form, and it would be great if you could fill the evaluation form and leave it at the reception. And we end now with a very short clip. I'm told it's just 90 seconds, a film done by the graphic facilitators on what they've seen over the past 3 days. Thank you.